Auschwitz, the Nazi death camp where more than 1 million people, mainly Jews, were murdered. People with families and friends. Ordinary people robbed of their future. Each had their own unique story of how they came to be at Auschwitz. Only a minority survived. And today, decades later, very few can explain what happened there as witness to its human terror.
Auschwitz, a testament to horror and humanity's responsibility. Today we gather to remember one of the darkest chapters in human history, Auschwitz, the Nazi concentration and extermination camp that became the ultimate symbol of cruelty, genocide, and the depths of human suffering. It is not merely a place on a map. It is a wound in the fabric of civilization, a reminder of what happens when hatred is allowed to flourish unchecked.
Kitty Hart-Marxen was 17 years old when she arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau in April 1943.
My name is Kitty Hart-Marxen, and I'm a Holocaust survivor.
Designed as a factory of death, no one was intended to survive, let alone describe its inhumanity to a world not yet ready to listen.
No one wanted to know, no one wanted to hear what I had to say. But I made a commitment that the people don't want to hear, but I'm going to make sure that they will. I've been here many times, but I really wanted to come with 2 girls who were my age when I was here. I want to show them the struggle for survival.
What were your first impressions of the camp?
There was just the most incredible mud. And then we saw like a glow in the distance. And soon when we got there, we saw ghost-like figures with shaved heads, staggering in tattered clothes, with great big eyes, screaming in all languages and being beaten. And we thought, my God, is this what's going to happen to us?
The origins of Auschwitz, a machine of death. Auschwitz was established in 1940 in occupied Poland, initially as a concentration camp for political prisoners, but soon it became something far more sinister, a factory of death, designed for the systematic extermination of millions. The Nazis expanded it into a vast complex, including Auschwitz I, Auschwitz II, and Auschwitz III, along with dozens of subcamps. Auschwitz was established in 1940 in the town of Auschwitz, Poland, which had been annexed by Nazi Germany. Initially, it was intended just for political prisoners, primarily the Polish residents and their members and intellectuals. As the Nazi regime expanded its genocidal policies, Auschwitz evolved into the largest and most infamous extermination camp.
I've known Kitty since I was born. I've known about her story since I was little and sort of grown up with the influence of it. What did you first see when you got off the train?
Alsatian dogs. They were barking, trying to get at us.
And I wanted to try and understand a bit better how she coped in these conditions and how she managed to survive for so long.
And we're walking into the women's camp now.
I met Kitty for the first time after the school talk she gave us, and I went up and asked some questions to her. And I'm just kind of nervous and excited because I want to see it from a different perspective that I may have seen it in class.
And you see these stumps? These are the chimneys of the wooden barracks.
What happens to you when you're in those formative years, age 13 to 16? It shapes you and your character for the whole of your life. Auschwitz is where my grandma feels she belongs, and it always calls her back.
Kitty Hart was one of the first survivors to tell her story. She gives us access to that experience with the power of her words. You have to treat what Kitty says almost like music. I hear what she says, and I also try to listen to what she has left unsaid.
You see this crossroad? The crossroad was the crossroad to life or death.
The very fact that Kitty was an eyewitness and can say, this is what I saw, actually ensures that it cannot be denied, that the intentionality of the perpetrators is clear, and that it's indisputable that what she saw is what happened.
The first transported prisoners arrived on June 14, 1940, consisting of 728 political prisoners from Tarnow. These early detainees were subjected to brutal forced labor, starvation, and executions. The camp's infrastructure was rapidly expanded, and by 1942, Auschwitz had become the central site for the final solution. The Nazi plan to systematically murder European Jews. The original camp, Auschwitz I, was built on former Polish army barracks. It housed prisoners under horrific conditions with overcrowded barracks, starvation rations, and constant abuse. The infamous, albeit mocked free sign at the entrance falsely promised freedom through labor, when in reality, most prisoners faced death.
So we were in a train that was specially converted to transport prisoners. And we traveled 48 hours standing before we arrived in Auschwitz. Well, we had absolutely no idea where we were. It was dark.
What did you first see when you got off the train?
Well, the thing opened up and you heard an awful lot of noise.
Were you scared?
Well, we were scared of the dogs,
Yeah.
and then the great big women with whips, and they were whipping everyone and urging everyone to run, 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 everything at a running pace. Suddenly, there was a weird kind of stench, and the closer we got, the worse the stench became. My mother said, "What a curious place there. Can you smell? Can you smell roasting meat?" I said, "Yes, I can." She said, "Do you think they're roasting chickens here this time of the night?" I said, "I don't know."
Kitty and her mother were sent to Birkenau, the largest of the 44 camps in the Auschwitz system, where they were processed and sent to quarantine.
When did you first stay in a wooden barrack?
Well, this was the quarantine, okay? So the first night we were pushed into here.
Did you find somewhere to sleep?
Well, we squeezed in somewhere here. I was incredibly cold that night because we were 48 hours without food, and I slept all night next to a woman. And she started speaking to me in German. It turned out she was a German gypsy.
Right.
During the early morning, while she was talking to me, she looked at my hand. She took my hand, she said, "Give me your hand." And she said, "You know, you're going to come out." And the next thing that happened, whistles blew suddenly. It was still dark. And everybody was saying, "Raus, raus, out." And because this was quarantine, we didn't know.
Yeah.
And I shook this woman, you know?
Yeah.
And she didn't move. And I said to my mother, "She's cold, she's dead."
From 1942 to 1944, freight trains arrived daily, carrying Jews, Poles, and Romani people, Soviet prisoners of war, and others, all condemned to suffering and death. The infamous, albeit mock phrase sign at the entrance mocked the prisoners, promising freedom through labor, when in reality, most would never leave alive.
And I said, "You know, you're cold, I'm cold. We need to strip her, and we need to have everything she's got."
Yeah.
Surviving Auschwitz was virtually impossible. And there was certainly no way you can say, if you did this, then this would happen. It was a matter of luck and chance and being in the right place at the right time. But there were some circumstances and some strategies that kind of worked.
That came to me that night, that actually that's the way to do it. That if you do have the people that had died, you've got to take everything off them. Because it was not good to them, was it?
You had to do what you needed to do to survive, and if that was taken from the dead, that's what it meant.
Not in the history of mankind has there been industrial killing on this scale. If something happened once, there's absolutely no reason why it can't happen again.
In 1943, Kitty was assigned to work on a new rail line into Birkenau called the Ramp. In 1944, she watched as transports of Jews from Hungary started to arrive.
What was the importance of the ramp?
People arrived in cattle trucks, and sometimes 7 or 10 trains would arrive in say, 24 hours, and people were sealed in, almost airtight, just a little bit of air coming through the slats. Sometimes the trains were sealed here for hours before they were allowed to unload.
Did people die in the trains?
Yeah, a lot of people died before they arrived here. Some people travelled 7 days before they arrived here.
Did anyone have any idea what was happening when they got off the train?
People had not the foggiest idea what was going to happen. Of course, there were people coming from the ghettos, so they didn't expect anything, good, obviously.
Auschwitz was a place where 1.1 million people were murdered, including 960,000 Jews, 74,000 Poles, 21,000 Romani, and thousands of others. The gas chambers, disguised as showers, became the final destination for countless innocent souls. Families were torn apart, children ripped from their mothers, and the elderly discarded as useless.
Everything was very nice and quiet because they didn't want people to panic. So loudspeakers were here telling people, well, there's a lot of typhus here, and so you're all going to be disinfected, and we've got to split. We went from women and women with children. Leave your luggage, you're going to get your luggage later. And then someone came, right, left, men this way, women women with children on one side, younger people are younger, you can go that way. Oh, you're older, you take your child with you, it'll be fine. You take your child, we're not going to split you up.
It was shocking to see that you stood in the exact same place as those people did once.
At the ramp, women with children and the elderly were sent directly to their death. And if you were young and able-bodied, and if at that period of time they needed workers, then you were chosen for slave labor, which essentially meant that you were chosen to die slowly, not to die immediately in the gas chambers.
Let me tell you, at this point, families were split, never ever saw one another again.
Those who were not immediately executed faced forced labor, starvation, medical experiments, and brutal punishments. The infamous Joseph Mengele, known as the Angel of Death, conducted horrific experiments on prisoners, treating human lives as disposable scientific subjects. On January 27, 1945, Soviet forces liberated Auschwitz, revealing the full extent of Nazi atrocities. Survivors emerged as living skeletons, their bodies broken but their spirits unyielding. The world was forced to confront the horrors of the Holocaust, and the phrase, "never again," became a solemn vow.
First of all, survival depended on the place of work. If you were working outside, and the commandos, which are work parties, you hadn't had a prayer to survive for long. The other thing you couldn't survive was without a pair of shoes. Well, the problem was that you were issued wooden clogs. Your clogs would get stuck in the mud, your feet would rub, they would get infected, and you were dead. If you didn't have your bowl, you were dead, because nobody would give you their bowl. So survival depended on if you could not think about anything, just have a tunnel vision and think like an animal. Just picture yourself, what does an animal do? What does an animal need? Well, it doesn't need very much just to live, but the first thing it needs to get away from the predators, get away from all these people that are trying to kill you.
Auschwitz II, the extermination center. In October 1941, construction began on Auschwitz II, which became the primary site for mass executions. It was designed to accommodate 100,000 prisoners and included 4 large gas chambers and crematoriums. By 1942, trains carrying Jews, Romani people, Soviet prisoners of war, and others arrived daily, with most victims sent directly to the gas chambers upon arrival.
So some of the men were taken this way. Okay. Some of the girls that were selected to go into the camp were taken through there. You were just told to go that way. And you know the road there. Where does that go?
The gas chambers.
That's it.
What happened when you arrived at camp?
Well, we were taken to a building like this, which we didn't know what it was, but it was called the sauna. Not like you and I understand it, a processing place. And the first thing that happened to you, you were stripped, everything was taken from you, you were smeared with a green fluid, your hair was shaved everywhere.
That was then packaged and shipped off for processing. Hair was used both to create cloth and to line submarines and as detonators.
And then you were tattooed, and believe you me, that was when you felt you were no longer the same person.
When that tattoo was placed on your arm, you weren't what your parents had given you as your name, you became that number, and that was your identification completely taken away.
Not only is it a disgusting thing to do to human beings, but that's my grandma, and they wanted to turn her into an animal.
Without your hair and without your clothing, you lose something very distinctive about you. And there are people who remember at that point that they looked ridiculous.
It was hard to imagine how she survived. Every corner she turned, there was something trying to stop her from living.
Auschwitz III was established to provide forced labor for the German industrial giant IG Farben. Prisoners were subjected to grueling work conditions, producing synthetic rubber and chemicals for the Nazi war effort. In 1944, Auschwitz had grown into a vast complex of over 40 subcounts, each serving different functions, from forced labor to medical experiments.
Did you know that the wooden sheds were actually meant for 52 horses? And so they put these bunk things up there.
And there were 1,000 people in there.
And 1,000 people inside, that's right.
What happened the first thing in the morning when you woke up?
You were woken up with the sound of whistles, roughly around about 4 in the morning. So roll calls took place twice a day, and roll calls was one of the greatest terrors of the camp. Whistles blew, and everybody now screams, out, 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 schnell, raus, raus. Total chaos. 1,000 people had to rush out of this door. And you see the ground, you're looking at grass, well, you must look at mud. The whole thing was just one sea of mud. I've always said, if you found a blade of grass, what would you do with it? You'd eat it. So people were just staggering around the mud, but of course you had to stand to attention.
Selection didn't just take place on arrival at Auschwitz, it was a daily occurrence. In fact, any time that prisoners were together, if anybody at any point in time tipped over into that place where they were no longer useful to the Nazis, they could simply be selected and sent into the gas chamber.
People just collapsed and died. Yeah. Died of tiredness, of exhaustion, of shock.
Did you ever have to collect the corpses after roll call?
Yes, yes. Oh, yes. When I was in the Leichenkommando, this is what we did.
The camp became a symbol of industrialized genocide, where efficiency and cruelty were intertwined in the Nazi regime's pursuit of racial extermination. The medical experiments conducted at Auschwitz were among the most horrific violations of human rights in history. Nazi doctors, particularly Joseph Mengele, carried out pseudo-scientific experiments on prisoners, often with no anesthesia, leading to immense suffering and death. There were genetic and twin studies. Mengele was obsessed with twins, believing they held the key to genetic superiority. He subjected them to painful injections, unnecessary surgeries, and even attempted to create artificial conjoined twins by sewing siblings together. Sterilization experiments. Nazi doctors tested chemical injections, radiation exposure, and surgical procedures to forcibly sterilize prisoners, aiming to prevent reproduction among groups they deemed inferior. There was disease and drug testing. Prisoners were deliberately injected with typhus, tuberculosis, and other diseases to study their effects. Some were given experimental drugs, often leading to agonizing deaths. Hypothermia and survival studies. Victims were submerged in freezing water for extended periods to test human endurance, often leading to fatal hypothermia. Chemical and eye color experiments. Chemicals were injected into prisoners' eyes in an attempt to change their color, reflecting Nazi racial ideology. These experiments were not scientific. They were acts of cruelty designed as research.
Now what I'm going to show you is the latrines, okay? Now you see that entrance? Mm-hmm. Thousands had to get through this entrance. And of course there was a functionary prisoner in charge and wouldn't let you in. But did you know, I worked there at one stage, so let's just show you what it was like.
How did you get the job to work here?
Well, I had to buy myself to work. I thought it'd be a good place, at least I'd have access to the lavatory.
Yeah.
I mean, it was horrible.
There's nothing further from what a 16-year-old girl would want to be doing with her life than having her arms in shit. And yet, for her, that was a privilege. Because when she was in the Scheißkommando, it meant that she wasn't digging a ditch. She didn't have somebody flogging her to death because she couldn't dig fast enough. She wasn't actually freezing to death because she was inside. And what's more, the Nazis were nowhere near that place. So being in the Scheißkommando was a 16-year-old's dream in Auschwitz.
So that was an open sewer. Thousands of women going in there. You had like 2 or 3 people to a hole because you didn't have it to yourself. And then when people were finishing, you had to dig all that stuff out. So everything had to come out.
Think of the idea that you have 35,000 people using these latrines. So it was designed again to dehumanize the people, to degrade them, to make them live in their own filth. Why do you dehumanize these people if you're going to kill them anyhow? Because if people look like a lump of feces, then it's easy to flush it down the toilet.
And what would happen if you couldn't get in? How would you go to the toilet?
You had your bowl.
Yeah.
And your bowl was virtually your food or your toilet.
Yeah.
The problem was washing it out, right?
Yeah.
How did you
No
wash it
water.
out? No water. In the winter, you had snow, you could wipe it out. In the summer, it wasn't so. And you couldn't do anything on the ground because if somebody'd pick it, see you.
You can get in trouble.
Well, never mind in trouble, you'd get killed.
Yeah.
Full stop.
After the war, the Nuremberg trials exposed these atrocities, leading to the creation of the Nuremberg Code, which established ethical guidelines for medical research. At the end of the Second World War, there was a notorious young female guard who worked inside of Auschwitz, Anne Bergen-Belsen, who was led toward the gallows for her execution. Irma Grasse was in her early 20s when she was executed for her crimes, and she was known as the hyena of Auschwitz. She was a torturer, a beast, and a brute who would take the lives of prisoners whenever she wanted, and she was known for beating and battering prisoners with her weapons. Here's a short summary about her.
There were many women who at the end of the Second World War escaped any form of punishment for their work inside the concentration camps. But what surprised many of the Allied liberators after they freed the inmates of sites of mass slaughter was that a lot of the women accused of terrifying crimes were young and in their early 20s. Irma Grasse was one of these women, and she was convicted for the terrible treatment and murder of prisoners inside of Auschwitz and also at Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. On the 13th of December 1945, one of the most evil female guards of the concentration camps and the Second World War made her walk into the execution chamber of Hamelin prison. She was chaperoned by a British executioner who would take her life, but he would also condemn hundreds of Nazi war criminals following the end of the deadliest conflict in history. She looked up to see the gallows structure where a noose had been passed over, and she stared ominously into the abyss as she was shuffled over the trapdoor. Then darkness. The cap was placed over her head, and a woman who was regarded as the hyena of Auschwitz, or the beautiful beast, took her final breath.
Auschwitz stands today as a memorial museum. ensuring that the voices of the victims are never silenced. It is a place of remembrance, education, and reflection, a stark warning of what happens when prejudice and authoritarianism go unchecked. We must ask ourselves, what lessons have we learned? Hatred still exists. Genocide has not disappeared. The responsibility to remember and educate falls upon us all. As we look at Auschwitz, let us not turn away from its horrors. Let us honor the victims by ensuring that their suffering was not in vain. Let us stand against hatred, discrimination, and injustice whenever they arise. Because history is not just the past, it is the present, and it is the future. Join me next time for Part 4, the liberation and aftermath of the war and the hostages. I hope you enjoyed this video. Have a good day.